The Boston Tea Party was a political protest that occurred on December 16, 1773, at Griffin's Wharf in Boston, Massachusetts. American colonists, frustrated and angry at Britain for imposing taxation without representation, dumped 342 chests of tea, imported by the British East India Company, into the harbor. The event was the first major act of defiance to British rule over the colonists. It showed Great Britain that Americans wouldn't take taxation and tyranny sitting down, and rallied American patriots across the 13 colonies to fight for independence. Why did the Boston Tea Party happen? In the 1760s, Britain was deep in debt, so British Parliament imposed a series of taxes on American colonists to help pay those debts. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed colonists on virtually every piece of printed paper they used, from playing cards and business licenses to newspapers and legal documents. The Townshend Acts of 1767 went a step further, taxing essentials such as paint, paper, glass, lead and tea. The British government felt the taxes were fair since much of its debt was earned fighting wars on the colonists' behalf. The colonists, however, disagreed. They were furious at being taxed without having any representation in Parliament, and felt it was wrong for Britain to impose taxes on them to gain revenue. On March 5, 1770, a street brawl happened in Boston between American colonists and British soldiers. Later known as the Boston Massacre, the fight began after an unruly group of colonists, frustrated with the presence of British soldiers in their streets, flung snowballs, ice and oyster shells at a British sentinel guarding the Boston Customs House. Reinforcements arrived and opened fire on the mob, killing 5 colonists and wounding 6. The Boston Massacre and its fallout further incited the colonists' rage towards Britain. Britain eventually repealed the taxes it had imposed on the colonists except the tea tax. It wasn't about to give up tax revenue on the nearly 1.2 million pounds of tea the colonists drank each year. In protest, the colonists boycotted tea sold by British East India Company and smuggled in Dutch tea, leaving British East India Company with millions of pounds of surplus tea and facing bankruptcy. In May 1773, British Parliament passed the Tea Act, which allowed British East India Company to sell tea to the colonies duty-free and much cheaper than other tea companies, but still taxed the tea when it reached colonial ports. Tea smuggling in the colonies increased, although the cost of the smuggled tea soon surpassed that of tea from British East India Company with the added tea tax. Still, with the help of prominent tea smugglers such as John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who protested taxation without representation but also wanted to protect their tea smuggling operations, colonists continued to rail against the tea tax and Britain's control over their interests. The Sons of Liberty were a group of colonial merchants and tradesmen founded to protest the Stamp Act and other forms of taxation. The group of revolutionists included prominent patriots such as Benedict Arnold, Patrick Henry and Paul Revere, as well as Adams and Hancock. Led by Adams, the Sons of Liberty held meetings rallying against British Parliament and protested the Griffin's Wharf arrival of Dartmouth, a British East India Company ship carrying tea. By December 16, 1773, Dartmouth had been joined by her sister ships, Beaver and Eleanor, all 3 ships loaded with tea from China. That morning, as thousands of colonists convened at the wharf and its surrounding streets, a meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House where a large group of colonists voted to refuse to pay taxes on the tea or allow the tea to be unloaded, stored, sold, or used. Ironically, the ships were built in America and owned by Americans. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the ships to return to Britain and ordered the tea tariff be paid and the tea unloaded. The colonists refused, and Hutchinson never offered a satisfactory compromise.